I don't happen to agree. I think probably neither book should be banned, because I doubt if the Quran is really the reason why the violence is perpetrated, although it's certainly sometimes used as an excuse. I don't think the law should be used very sparingly against outlawing opinions, but I also happen to believe that laws against denying the Holocaust or denying, say, the Turkish genocide of Armenians is a wise thing to have. I think these people are perfectly capable of ridiculing or criticizing these opinions, and I don't think the law should be used to do so. The law against insult on the grounds of race or creed, which is also on the books of several European democracies, is more problematic, I think. Partly because insult or offence is very subjective. People can be insulted or feel offended by many statements which are not even, sometimes not meant to insult or to offend. In some ways, I think offence or the risk of offending people is the price we have to pay for free speech. The problem is also when people feel collectively offended, who actually decides whether there is a collective offence. It's usually self-appointed or non-elected community leaders who tell us that they represent a community and become kind of policemen of what kind of speech about their community is permissible and what it is not, which, and sometimes for very good and well-meaning reasons. It's no doubt true that sometimes it's necessary to make a fuss when people use offensive language or express offensive ideas about others. And somebody has to do it, but this can go too far, and sometimes the policemen of speech have vested interests in keeping this going, and it can sometimes lead, and I think this is perhaps the greatest danger, in silence where silence is undesirable. I would use as an example of this Japanese state television. The Japanese state television company, the government financed television company, NHK, has a list of words which, for people who are physically disabled, for various minorities, in particular for the so-called burakumin, the untouchables, people who are traditionally thought to be ritually unclean and which you find in many Buddhist societies who did work to do associated with death and were therefore unclean and were, as a consequence, were discriminated against. Now, there are various, although by law these people, the burakumin, the outcasts, are equal to all other citizens in Japan, they are still being discriminated against by companies when it comes to marriage and so on in practice. Various groups represent them and make sure that people use the right words and don't use offensive terms and so on. But they are so bent on policing language, and the language, of course, as is also the case usually when it comes to policing what is permissible and what isn't. Language tends to change fairly regularly, which is again a way to give a certain authority to the people who police it. And it's become so fraught, the language and the use of language, and so difficult and so contentious that Japanese state television, radio never discusses the problem of the outcasts at all. Better silence than to be accused of discrimination. And I think this is a warning against being too zealous about the use of language. Now, if the law should be used very sparingly in making sure that the dignity of people is preserved, that people don't use insulting language and so on, and we can all agree that that is a desirable state of affairs. I think there are many ways in which freedom of speech is limited by social consent. There are many grey areas not touched by the laws. When people talk about free speech, they sometimes, or the defenders of free speech, especially against people whose opinions or principles or values they don't like, tend to talk about free speech as though it can ever be, the freedom of free speech as though it can be absolute. But of course it can't, it never is. And there are many examples in any society of where there is a consensus that certain things are not said, that certain words are not used. But the reason why this is very difficult, I think, to control by law is that the offensiveness of what is said depends almost entirely on who is saying what about whom, under what circumstances. I happen to live in Harlem, in New York City, a largely black area, and as soon as you walk out into the street, you'll hear the word nigger everywhere, constantly. It's a word that is constantly used by African Americans amongst themselves. If I were to use it, or many of us in this hall, it would be a very different proposition, and it would be by no means so well received. It depends, I think, very much when we talk about what things are said, on who is saying it. Something that people can say in a saloon bar becomes a real problem if it's said by a politician. Something that can be expressed by an artist who's trying to push the limits of what is permissible is not quite the same thing as something that is said by a journalist or an academic. Critics of Islam, who are often right-wing nationalists, tend to, and the Geert Wilders, the politician I just mentioned, the Danish cartoons is another example, tend to have a particular tactic, which is to be as provocative as they possibly can, to be deliberately offensive about Muslims, and then hoping for a reaction. And as soon as there is a reaction, then to claim to be the champions of free speech, which is an essential Western value now under threat by the Muslim aliens. I think one has to be very careful when this happens, and one should not be hoodwinked by such populists into muting one's criticism of what they're saying for fear of not being enough of a friend of the freedom of speech or liberal values. The other comparison often made by people who are warning us against the severe threat of Islam to Western liberal society is to compare the critics of Christianity historically to the critics of Islam. Voltaire is often invoked by the likes of Geert Wilders, who was of course a ferocious critic of Christianity, and not only of Christianity, but of all religions, but particularly of Christianity. And so the argument goes, so why can Wilders or anybody else not be just as scathing about Islam? Well, I think again there is a difference of circumstances. Voltaire was attacking one of the two most powerful institutions in 18th century France. Criticism of Islam or Muslims in Europe today is to criticize members of an already vulnerable minority. It also makes a difference, I think, whether you're an outsider or an insider. I think that people, Jews, Muslims, Christians, anybody who's a member of a minority can legitimately express him or herself in a critical manner about his or her religion or race or creed in a way that somebody who's a member of the majority cannot. I mean, these are all elements that have to be taken into consideration. If you don't take them into consideration, I think it's very difficult to find ways of having a civilized discourse and expressing our differences of opinion and criticizing people without it resulting in violence. So these informal rules of discourse will be tested, will be negotiated, and as a result of that, I think we come to let's call them common rules, and a certain amount of pressure. Informal pressure can be a very good thing. Political correctness is now become almost a dirty word, but there are aspects of political correctness that are useful and have had a positive result. I think we should all be grateful that people cannot respectably talk about kikes or chinks or indeed niggers unless, as I said, it's used in a certain manner of speech by members of the minority itself, and even then some people are legitimately critical of it. In the case of Muslims, I think the negotiation about these common rules have become more difficult because of the apocalyptic tone of the debate. Muslim violence or violence committed in the name of Islam is real. There is a violent revolutionary element, as we know, and because that violence is compared to 1938, or as one American, particularly alarmist American writer on this subject said, Europe is in its Weimar moment. Any concession becomes appeasement. I think one more reason why religion is a particularly tricky subject when it comes to freedom of speech, trickier, I would say, than, say, pornography ever was, is that it's not, by definition, really a rational issue. Religion is not a political opinion about which one can argue, which has merits that can be debated reasonably, although some people have tried to do that. I think it's ultimately fruitless. You either believe something or you don't believe it, but it's not something that can be that can be an appeal to reason is often inadequate to explain the nature of belief. Now, people say that religion, in particular religion, needs to be respected. Does it deserve respect? Atheists claim that it's unnecessary and indeed almost insulting to have to respect something which one deplores, which one despises. Why should one respect people for having beliefs which one believes oneself to be ridiculous? And I think it depends on one's definition of the word respect. I don't think respect ever implies agreement or even approval. I think all that's needed really is the dignity of something being acknowledged, of something being acknowledged as existing, and having the right to exist, and being given a certain amount of space. Dignity, in a word, perhaps, is better than respect. Salman Rushdie made a distinction between beliefs and the believers. Belief is something that can be legitimately attacked and criticized and ridiculed. Believers cannot. One should not insult a person simply because he or she believes something, but one can certainly criticize that belief. Now, I think that's a useful distinction. The problem with it is that to a real believer, of course, the distinction doesn't really exist. If you attack a belief, you attack the believer, because it's part of, it's not just something that, like a political opinion, or it's not simply a position or something that's free-floating that one happens to believe. For a real believer, it's part of your identity, it's part of who you are. But I think for a liberal democratic society to work, one thing we can demand and should demand of religious believers is that they do at least learn to live with that distinction. The threat of violence or the use of violence as a result of feeling insulted by non-believers should not be permissible. But we should make allowances for the dignity of those whose beliefs we cannot share. And perhaps we can do so by observing a certain discretion when it comes to religious symbols or the contents of the theology of a belief, by separating political from religious debate. We could leave theological issues to the believers unless their actions break the law. In other words, I think it's perfectly permissible to attack religious authorities, especially when they use their belief as a reason for policies or things that impinge on secular society, which we consider to be harmful. In other words, when the Pope, in his utterances, makes it harder for people in poor societies of Latin America, for example, to stop having families which are unsustainable. I think it's absolutely legitimate to criticize the Pope for that belief, but one need not really engage with the theology in order to do that. I think one can disagree with things that, in other words, one can disagree with things which can be rationally disagreed with. One can disagree with that policy without necessarily getting into discussion about Immaculate Conception. And perhaps as a way to conclude this, we can go back to Confucius, the wise Chinese sage, who's often considered to be a secular man, and indeed his moral beliefs and his principles were largely secular. Confucius was, after all, a political consultant who went around China trying to find work as a consultant of rulers in how to order their kingdoms. But there is no proof that he was not a believer in supernatural forces, or heaven as it was called in China. But he did manage to separate the two. In that sense, the Chinese were way ahead of Christendom, already many years before Christ was born, of course. And he said it best when he was asked by his disciple, Zelu, how to serve the spirits and gods. He said, "Let us leave the spirits aside until we know how best to serve men." And I will conclude with those wise words. Thank you.